Imagine receiving a mysterious New Year's card, one that seems to carry more than just well wishes. Its cryptic messages hint at a far darker fate. As the winds howl outside, a sense of unease creeps in. Strange figures appear in your reflection, shadows that don't belong, whispering secrets only you can hear. An abandoned house beckons you, but you can't look away. It's not just the start of a new year, it's the beginning of something sinister, a chilling journey where terror lurks at every turn. Prepare to step into a world where every door hides a secret, every card holds a curse, and no one is ever truly alone. Welcome to a nightmare that begins with a simple greeting. The ghost of New Year's Eve. On New Year's Eve, a group of young friends decided to spend the night at a secluded, old farmhouse nestled in the quiet countryside of rural America. The house was known to be somewhat eerie, but for the thrill-seekers among them, it was the perfect place to usher in the new year. The group had no idea that their decision would turn their holiday into a nightmare that would haunt them forever. The farmhouse had always stood alone, its faded paint peeling under the weight of countless winters. It had an air of mystery, one that seemed to press on their shoulders as they pulled up the long, winding driveway. The setting sun cast long shadows across the property, and the sky turned a dark, inky purple as if warning them to turn back. But they were young, excited, and naive. They laughed it off as they unloaded their bags and prepared for the night ahead. The night grew darker, and the air became colder, sharper. It was as if the world outside had quieted down, as if time itself had slowed. Inside the house, they gathered around the fireplace, sharing stories, drinking, and playing games. There was an unsettling tension in the air, but they brushed it off, attributing it to the building excitement of the upcoming celebration. They were here to have fun, after all, right? As midnight approached, they decided to try something a bit more daring. A game their grandparents had played, something old, something forgotten by time. They pulled out a dusty Ouija board that had been left in the attic and began to set it up. "Let's see if we can contact some spirits," one of them joked, half laughing. But the others hesitated, unsure whether they should proceed. Despite their fears, they continued setting up the board. One by one, their hands rested lightly on the planchette. The atmosphere shifted. What had been lighthearted and fun was now tinged with unease. They all exchanged nervous glances, their laughter fading. The silence in the room was thick, as if the air itself was holding its breath. "Is there anyone here?" one of them asked, breaking the silence. The planchette moved. Not much, but enough to catch their attention. A cold draft swept through the room, extinguishing the candles on the table. The temperature dropped dramatically, and the flames in the fireplace flickered and sputtered. It felt like the house was breathing, as if something ancient, something alive was waking up. The planchette began to move again, slowly at first, then faster, as if it had its own mind. It spelled out a name, Samuel. "Who's Samuel?" one of the girls whispered, but no one had an answer. The atmosphere in the room had become suffocating, heavy with an energy they couldn't explain. A feeling of dread washed over them, creeping up their spines and making their skin prickle. The room seemed to get darker, the shadows deepening as if something was watching them. The temperature continued to drop. They all felt it now. This wasn't just a game anymore. It was real. Suddenly, the planchette jerked violently and then stopped, pointing to the word die. "Who's going to die?" one of the boys asked, his voice trembling. Before anyone could respond, a chilling voice, soft and breathy, echoed through the room. "It's time for you to leave or become one of us." The air felt thick, suffocating. The fire was out completely now, and the room was plunged into darkness. Panic set in as the group fumbled for their phones, trying desperately to turn on flashlights, but there was no signal, no connection to the outside world. In the darkness, they heard the faintest of sounds, a whisper. Then another, louder this time, and then a figure appeared in the doorway, faint at first, but growing more solid with every passing second. A tall, gaunt man with hollow eyes and a twisted grin, his face obscured by shadow, but his presence overwhelming. The figure's voice, hoarse and raspy, echoed through the room again. "I've been waiting for you," he said, his voice sending shivers down their spines. The group froze, paralyzed with fear. The man stepped closer, his slow, deliberate movements unnatural, as though he were gliding rather than walking. His feet didn't seem to touch the ground. The air around him was colder than anything they had ever felt, an icy chill that gnawed at their bones. His grin widened, stretching unnaturally, until it seemed to reach the very edges of his face. The group backed away, stumbling over each other in their desperate attempt to flee, but the doors wouldn't open. The windows were sealed shut, as if the house itself had trapped them inside. No matter how hard they pushed or pulled, the exits remained firmly closed. The man's voice came again, this time louder, more insistent. "You're not going anywhere. Not until one of you takes my place." In their panic, they realized that something was terribly wrong. The house wasn't just old. It was alive, feeding off their fear. The ghostly figure was a part of it, and it wouldn't let them go without a price. In the distance, the sound of distant bells rang, signaling midnight, the arrival of the new year. But as the clock struck 12, the air grew still. Time seemed to freeze. The lights flickered back to life, and for a moment, everything seemed normal again. The fire was roaring in the hearth once more, and the cold was gone. The figure in the doorway had disappeared. It was as if nothing had happened at all, but something was off. One of the group was missing. They searched the house frantically, calling out for their friend, but it was as if they had never been there at all. Their belongings were gone, their footprints vanished. Only an empty space remained where they had once sat. The air was thick with the smell of decay and damp earth. And then, in the reflection of the window, they saw the face of the man. He was smiling, standing behind them, watching them with his hollow eyes. The night had changed them. No one spoke of it the next day, but they knew. The house had claimed one of them, and from that moment on, the farmhouse remained empty, the land cursed, and the new year forever marked by the presence of the ghostly figure that haunted the darkness. And every year since then, when the clock strikes midnight on New Year's Eve, they feel the chilling presence of Samuel, waiting for his next victim. The Dark Village. It was meant to be a peaceful New Year's getaway. A small family, seeking respite from the hustle and bustle of New York City, decided to take a road trip north. They had heard of a quiet village in the mountains, known for its tranquility and untouched beauty. The idea of spending a few days surrounded by snow-covered trees and silence felt like the perfect escape. Little did they know, their journey would turn into a nightmare, a horrific encounter with something far darker than they could ever have imagined. The family consisted of Thomas, the father, his wife, Emily, and their teenage daughter, Sophie. They packed up their car with warm clothes, food, and the excitement of a fresh start for the year ahead. The road trip began smoothly, the winding highways flanked by tall trees, their branches heavy with snow. But as they drove further from the city, the atmosphere began to change. The air grew colder, the roads more desolate, and the villages they passed seemed to grow fewer and farther apart. Around dusk, as the sun dipped behind the mountains, they noticed something strange. Their GPS signal flickered and disappeared. It was odd, but nothing to worry about, they thought. After all, they were heading to a remote location. However, when they tried to use their phones to look up the village's name, they found that they had no reception. "Must be the mountains," Thomas muttered, trying to reassure his wife. "We're almost there." Sophie looked out the window, her breath fogging up the glass. The road was narrow, winding through dense trees that seemed to close in around them. There was a sense of isolation, a foreboding quiet that made her uneasy. She glanced at her parents, both lost in thought, but something in the air felt wrong, as though they were being watched. As they rounded a bend, they saw a small sign on the side of the road, weathered and faded, but still legible. Dale Hollow, the village they had been searching for. Sophie felt a strange chill, but she didn't say anything. The car slowed as they entered the village, and for a moment, everything seemed normal. A few houses, all of them dark and empty, sat on either side of the road. It was exactly what they had imagined. a quiet, almost forgotten place. The streets were deserted, and the only sound was the crunching of snow beneath their tires. They passed by an old stone church, its steeple rising high above the village. A cemetery lay behind it, the gravestones almost swallowed by the thick snow. But something was odd. The windows of the houses were all dark, and there were no signs of life anywhere. "Let's find the inn and get settled in," Emily suggested, trying to shake off the uncomfortable feeling that had settled over her. They had already driven so far, and they needed rest. The car turned into a narrow alley, following a faint sign pointing to a small inn. The building appeared as if it had been abandoned for years, though a soft light flickered in the window. The door creaked as they entered, the warmth of the inn's interior a welcome relief from the chill outside. But the air inside was heavy, thick with the smell of dust and something else, something faintly rancid. A man stood behind the counter, his face obscured by shadow. He was tall, with deep lines etched into his face, his eyes too pale, too lifeless. "Welcome," he said, his voice hoarse, almost as if it had been years since he had spoken. "You're the only ones tonight." They exchanged uncertain glances but didn't question him. There were no other guests, no signs of life outside, and nowhere else to go. The man handed them a rusty key to a room upstairs. His fingers brushed against Emily's hand for a moment, sending an icy shiver up her spine. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Enjoy your stay," he murmured, his gaze lingering a little too long. The family retreated to their room, the floorboards creaking underfoot as they climbed the stairs. Sophie, unable to shake the feeling of being watched, hurried to the window. The village looked different from above, almost as if it had been frozen in time. The houses, the church, even the trees outside were all still, as if the world had stopped moving. Thomas and Emily sat on the bed, unpacking, but Sophie couldn't bring herself to relax. She wandered around the room, her eyes catching on an old painting on the wall, a family portrait, faded and yellowed with age. They looked oddly familiar, their expressions stiff and unnatural, their eyes staring straight at her. She shuddered and pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling. But that night, sleep didn't come easily. The wind howled outside, the snowstorm intensifying. But it wasn't the weather that kept her awake. It was the feeling of something lurking in the dark. Around midnight, Sophie awoke to a noise. It was faint at first, the sound of something tapping against the window. She tried to ignore it, but it grew louder, more insistent. Thump, thump, thump. Sitting up, she glanced toward the window, her heart racing. The snow outside was thick, swirling around in the wind, but through the frosted glass, she saw something moving. A shadow, a figure. It was standing just outside the inn, staring at her. Sophie gasped, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle the scream that threatened to escape. She watched in horror as the figure moved closer to the window. It was tall, impossibly tall, its face hidden in the darkness. But she could see its eyes pale, lifeless, like the man at the inn. Terrified, Sophie backed away from the window, but she couldn't look away. The figure stepped closer, its long, thin fingers pressing against the glass. Then it smiled, a slow, twisted grin that stretched impossibly wide. Without warning, the window shattered, the glass falling to the floor in 1,000 tiny pieces. Sophie screamed, scrambling backward into the corner of the room. The figure stepped through the shattered window as if it were made of mist, its body flickering and shifting, half human, half something else. It reached out toward her, and Sophie bolted from the room, screaming for her parents. She burst into their room, shaking them awake. "Mom, Dad, something's outside." Thomas and Emily scrambled to their feet, confused and frightened, but they didn't have time to question her. The inn was shaking, the walls groaning, as if the entire building were alive. There was a loud bang, followed by the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from the hallway. "Get downstairs now," Thomas yelled, grabbing Sophie's hand. They rushed down the stairs, but when they reached the main floor, they saw the innkeeper standing in the doorway, blocking their way. His eyes were no longer dull, but glowing, burning with a malevolent light. "You shouldn't have come," he hissed, his voice low and guttural. "Now you're part of the village, and the village needs new blood." Behind him, the door to the inn slammed open, and Sophie saw the figure from the window step into the light, its face now clear. It was no longer human. Its skin was stretched too thin, its body unnaturally elongated. It moved toward them with an eerie grace, its pale eyes locked onto Sophie, its mouth widening into a grotesque grin. In that moment, they understood the village of Dale Hollow wasn't just abandoned. It was a trap, a place where the living were lured to become a part of something far older, far darker. The innkeeper, the figure outside, the village itself, everything had been waiting for them. And now, they too would become part of its cursed existence. As the figure closed in, Emily screamed, but it was already too late. The darkness enveloped them, and the world outside the village seemed to vanish. The last thing Sophie heard was the sound of bells ringing, signaling the arrival of the new year. But it wasn't the celebration she had hoped for. It was the beginning of an endless nightmare. And every year, when the clock strikes midnight, the village of Dale Hollow waits. It waits for new victims, and it waits for the next family to drive too far to fall into its trap. The haunting New Year's card. The December winds howled outside Lisa's small apartment in Brooklyn, making the windows rattle with every gust. Inside, the warmth of the heater did little to quell the feeling of isolation that seemed to hang in the air like a dense fog. It was a few days before New Year's Eve, and Lisa had hoped for a quiet, solitary celebration. Just her a bottle of wine, and perhaps a good book. After the chaos of the year, she longed for peace. She had no close family, no significant other, just herself and her routine. But when she returned home from work that evening, she found a small envelope slipped under her door. It was a simple, plain white envelope. No name, no return address, no hint of who it was from. Curious, Lisa picked it up, her fingers lightly brushing the paper. The envelope was cold, almost as if it had been sitting in the snow for hours. She frowned, but shrugged it off. Maybe it was a holiday card from a distant acquaintance. It wasn't uncommon for people to send greetings at this time of year, even if they weren't close. She opened the envelope, and inside was a single, dark card. At first glance, it seemed like a normal New Year's card, generic, with a cheerful, Happy New Year printed in bold, golden letters. But there was something off about it. The card's design was a dark, wintry scene, a house in the midst of a snowstorm, its windows glowing dimly in the dark night. It looked almost abandoned, the snow around it thick and suffocating. The colors were muted, like the card had been forgotten in an old box for years. Lisa flipped the card over, expecting to see a message from the sender. But instead of the typical holiday greetings, there was only a single, handwritten line in scratchy, uneven handwriting. "This year will be your beginning if you dare to stay." Her stomach tightened at the words. They didn't make sense. The sentence had an odd, foreboding tone. It was almost as if the person knew something about her, a secret she hadn't even told herself. But that was ridiculous. It was just a card, a strange prank perhaps. Still, Lisa couldn't shake the unease it caused. Why had they written it that way? Why such a cryptic message? She placed the card on the kitchen counter, dismissing it as some bizarre joke. After all, who would send something like that on New Year's Eve? She decided to ignore it, focusing on preparing her simple dinner. But even as she chopped vegetables, the card seemed to call to her. Its image, the dark house, the shadowed windows, kept creeping into her mind. She couldn't stop glancing at it, couldn't shake the nagging feeling that there was more to it than she realized. That night, as Lisa settled into bed, she tried to forget the card. She buried herself under the warm covers, listening to the wind howl outside, trying to lull herself into sleep. But something wasn't right. Her mind wouldn't quiet. The words on the card replayed in her head, over and over again. "This year will be your beginning, if you dare to stay." The sentence echoed in her ears like a chant, growing louder and louder. She tossed and turned, her eyes flicking open and shut, her skin prickling with cold sweat. Finally, In the stillness of the room, she heard something faint, almost imperceptible. A scratching sound like fingernails scraping against wood. She froze, her heart thumping in her chest. The scratching continued, soft but deliberate. It was coming from the other side of her bedroom door. She held her breath, straining to hear. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the house settling. It was something else, something alive, something trying to get in. Her pulse quickened. "No, it's nothing," she whispered to herself. "Just the wind, just your mind playing tricks." But as the scratching grew louder, it became impossible to ignore. The sound was persistent, growing more frantic, more desperate. Her eyes darted to the door. It was closed. The lock was intact. There was no way anything could be outside. But then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. Lisa let out a shaky breath, her body trembling with fear. She told herself she was being foolish. It was just the house settling, nothing more. But deep down, she knew something wasn't right. Suddenly, a chill swept through the room. It wasn't the cold from outside. It was a deeper, more unnatural cold, like the air itself was turning to ice. Her breath fogged in front of her, despite the heater running full blast. And then she saw it. In the dim light of the moon, she saw the shadow. It was just outside her bedroom window, faint but unmistakable. A figure, tall and thin, moving slowly through the snow-covered street below. Lisa's heart raced. Who was that? What were they doing outside her window at this hour? Her hands shook as she grabbed her phone and opened the window. But when she looked outside, there was nothing, no one. The street was empty. The snowflakes drifted lazily through the air, but there was no shadow, no figure, nothing. "Get a grip," she whispered to herself, slamming the window shut. "It's just your imagination." But as she turned to head back to bed, she noticed something on the floor, something she hadn't seen before. The card, the one she had placed on the kitchen counter. It was lying in the middle of the room, face up, as if it had been moved, as if someone had placed it there. Lisa's blood ran cold. The words on the card had changed. "I'm waiting for you." Her breath hitched. The handwriting, it was the same, but the message was different. The card had been completely still just moments before. How could it have changed? Lisa stepped back, her heart thudding painfully in her chest. Something was happening, something that was beyond her understanding. She could feel it now. The presence. It was there, in the room with her. It had been there all along. The scratching sound returned, louder this time, now coming from within the walls. Something was clawing, scraping, trying to break free. Lisa pressed her hands to her ears, her mind spiraling into panic. The room felt smaller, suffocating, the walls closing in on her. Then, as if summoned by her fear, the door to her apartment creaked open. She didn't move. She couldn't move. The figure from earlier was standing in the doorway, its face obscured by shadow, but she could feel its eyes, cold, unblinking, staring straight at her. Its long, bony fingers twitched. "You shouldn't have opened the card," it whispered, its voice like the scraping of nails on glass. Lisa stumbled backward, her heart slamming in her chest. She had to run. She had to get out. But as she turned to flee, the figure stepped forward. It was no longer outside. It was in the room with her. It was here. The lights flickered, then went out completely. The room plunged into darkness. Lisa's breath came in ragged gasps. She fumbled for her phone, but the screen was black. The air was thick with dread, every inch of the room vibrating with an unseen presence. Her skin crawled as though thousands of unseen insects were crawling across her body. Suddenly, the figure spoke again, its voice so close now that Lisa could feel the coldness of its breath on her face. "This year, you will begin anew. You will stay. Forever." Lisa screamed. It was the last sound she made before the darkness swallowed her whole. If you enjoy spine-chilling stories and mysterious legends, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to my channel. Turn on the notification bell so you never miss any of my newest videos. Your support helps us bring more thrilling content your way. Join the adventure and be part of the community today.